Title: Police found this journal inside an abandoned cabin. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story begins. What the police found inside the abandoned cabin was never meant to be read. The journal was damp, warped, and stained with age, yet every page was filled edge to edge as if the writer knew time was running out. This was not a story meant for the public. It was evidence. And by the end of it, even the investigators wished it had stayed buried. The cabin stood less than a mile from the county line, deep in a stretch of forest that no longer appeared on modern maps. It had been flagged for demolition after a survey drone picked up its collapsed roof and extensive rot. Yet what drew law enforcement to it was not the structure itself. It was the absence of records. No property ownership. No construction permit. No tax history. The cabin had existed without explanation, as though it had been overlooked by time itself. The responding officers arrived late in the afternoon, guided by outdated forestry markers that had not been replaced in decades. The surrounding woods were unnaturally dense, the trees growing too close together, their trunks warped and leaning inward. The ground beneath them was soft and uneven, layered with decomposing leaves that muffled movement. The forest showed no recent signs of wildlife. No tracks. No scat. No broken branches. It was as if animals avoided the area entirely. The cabin was smaller than expected, barely more than a single-room structure with an attached storage shed that had collapsed inward. The wood was darkened almost black, not from fire, but from prolonged exposure to moisture and decay. Moss crept up the sides in thick, choking layers. The windows were gone, replaced by jagged frames filled with cobwebs and grime. The front door hung slightly open, swaying just enough to suggest it had not been disturbed recently. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, carrying the smell of mold, rot, and something faintly metallic. The floorboards sagged under their own weight. Furniture sat exactly where it had been left decades earlier, coated in dust so thick it muted every shape. A small table, a chair, a rusted stove, a bed frame with no mattress. Nothing appeared broken or overturned. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of habitation in recent years. What unsettled the officers most was how intentional the abandonment felt. The cabin had not been ransacked by scavengers. Nothing had been removed. Nothing had been packed. It was as though whoever had lived there had simply stopped existing mid-routine. The journal was discovered beneath the table, wedged between a loose floorboard and the dirt foundation below. It had been wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly disintegrated, leaving the book exposed to moisture and decay. Despite this, the pages inside were preserved unnaturally well. The ink had not bled. The paper had not rotted. It appeared almost untouched by time. The journal contained no name on the cover, no date, no dedication. Just page after page of tightly packed writing, each entry more frantic than the last. The first pages were calm, methodical, almost boring in their detail. Whoever wrote them had been meticulous, observant, and deeply analytical. The author described arriving at the cabin after purchasing it from an unnamed intermediary who insisted on cash and provided no paperwork. The location had appealed to the writer due to its isolation and the promise of quiet. The forest was described as peaceful at first, almost comforting. The cabin, though old, had felt solid and reliable. The writer noted an immediate sense of relief upon settling in, as though they had finally escaped something unnamed but persistent. Early entries focused on mundane routines: repairs to the roof, clearing brush, stockpiling supplies, cataloging tools. The writer had intended to live there indefinitely, documenting daily observations of the forest, the weather, and their own mental state. It was clear the journal was meant to be both record and anchor. Subtle inconsistencies appeared within the first month of entries. The writer mentioned sounds at night that did not match the normal patterns of wildlife. Not screams or footsteps, but rhythmic disturbances, like something brushing against the cabin walls in deliberate intervals. The author dismissed these as branches or shifting ground, though they noted the sounds occurred even on still nights with no wind. The forest itself began to change in the writer's observations. Paths that had been walked daily seemed to stretch longer without explanation. Landmarks disappeared or shifted position. Trees marked with cuts or symbols were later found unmarked, or replaced by entirely different trees. The writer expressed concern that fatigue or isolation might be affecting perception, but the entries remained logical and self-critical rather than paranoid. Several weeks in, the writer described discovering unfamiliar footprints near the cabin. They were not human, but they were not animal either. The impressions were elongated, pressed deep into the soil, and appeared to have been made by something that walked upright but unevenly. The tracks circled the cabin once before vanishing at the treeline. No fear was expressed in the journal at this point, only curiosity. The writer took measurements, sketched the prints, and noted their depth and spacing. There was no mention of reporting the discovery to authorities. The isolation had already begun to sever the writer's sense of external accountability. The first true shift in tone occurred when the writer documented an event that could not be rationalized. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, the ground around the cabin was completely undisturbed. No footprints, no runoff, no pooled water. It was as though the storm had never happened, despite clear evidence of rainfall on the roof and surrounding foliage. That same entry described the feeling of being observed while inside the cabin, particularly when writing. The sensation was not described as fear, but as pressure, like an awareness pressing inward from all directions. The writer noted that the feeling vanished whenever they stopped recording their thoughts. As the days passed, the journal entries grew longer and more detailed. The writer began documenting time discrepancies. Hours lost. Sunsets occurring too early or too late. Waking to find pages filled with writing they did not remember producing. The handwriting matched perfectly. The tone did not. The forest became increasingly hostile in the writer's descriptions. Sounds followed the author during walks, maintaining a fixed distance. Shadows appeared where no objects existed to cast them. The cabin itself began to feel altered. Measurements taken of the interior no longer matched previous records. The walls seemed closer together, the ceiling lower. One entry described finding handprints on the inside walls of the cabin, pressed into the dust at shoulder height. They were too large to belong to the writer. The fingers were too long, the spacing unnatural. The writer cleaned the walls thoroughly and documented the process in detail. The following morning, the handprints had returned. The journal noted an overwhelming sense that the cabin was no longer empty, despite no physical evidence of another presence. The writer began sleeping in shorter intervals, recording every waking moment. Food supplies diminished faster than expected. Tools were misplaced and later found in locations the writer insisted they had not visited. The most disturbing entries described moments of recognition. The writer began to feel that the forest was learning their habits, anticipating movement, adjusting paths, closing off familiar routes while opening others that led deeper into unfamiliar terrain. Attempts to leave the area resulted in disorientation, with the writer repeatedly finding themselves back at the cabin without recalling how they returned. The journal's language shifted subtly. Sentences became fragmented. Observations repeated with minor variations, as if the writer were trying to convince themselves of reality through repetition. Certain phrases appeared again and again, written with increasing pressure, tearing the paper beneath. By the time the first chapter of the journal ended, the writer no longer referred to the cabin as a shelter. It was described as an extension of the forest, something grown rather than built. The writer expressed the belief that the cabin had not been abandoned, but was waiting for someone willing to notice it, and once noticed, never allowed to leave. The second half of the journal no longer followed a consistent structure. Dates were present, but they contradicted one another. Entire weeks repeated. Some entries referenced events that had not yet been recorded, while others described moments already documented in detail, yet written as if they were happening for the first time. The sense of linear time dissolved completely. The writer became increasingly aware that the journal itself was changing. Pages once filled were later discovered blank. Ink faded and reappeared. Entire sections rewrote themselves between readings. The author began marking page numbers, only to find them altered later, shifted forward or backward by several digits. It became clear that the journal was no longer a passive object. It was participating. The forest's behavior grew more deliberate. Trees appeared closer to the cabin each morning, though measurements taken confirmed the impossibility of such movement. The writer noted bark patterns that resembled scar tissue, as though the forest had been damaged and healed repeatedly. Certain trees bore deep vertical splits that resembled mouths frozen mid-expression. These markings were not present on earlier surveys. Attempts to document wildlife failed entirely. No animals were seen. No birds. No insects. The silence was not peaceful, but restrained, as if the environment were holding itself still. The writer began to suspect the forest was not empty, but occupied by something that did not require the natural signs of life. Sleep became fragmented and unreliable. The writer recorded waking moments where the cabin appeared unfamiliar, its layout subtly rearranged. The stove shifted closer to the wall. The table rotated slightly. The bed frame angled toward the door. These changes were small but cumulative, creating a growing sense that the space was reshaping itself around the writer's presence. One section of the journal described a realization that the cabin was not meant to be lived in. It was described as a threshold, a structure grown to acclimate whatever entered the forest to its rules. The writer theorized that the cabin was designed to soften resistance, to introduce subtle distortions gradually rather than all at once. As the entries progressed, the writer stopped leaving the cabin entirely. Paths no longer led anywhere recognizable. The forest closed in immediately beyond the clearing, dense enough to block light even during midday. Attempts to mark trees resulted in the marks disappearing within hours, replaced by smooth bark or unfamiliar growth patterns. The writer began to describe physical sensations that had no visible cause. Pressure behind the eyes, a heaviness in the chest, a persistent vibration beneath the floorboards that could be felt but not heard. These sensations intensified whenever the writer considered abandoning the journal or leaving the area. The journal increasingly framed itself as a necessity. The writer believed that recording events delayed something unnamed. That observation itself acted as a barrier. Several entries suggested that when the writer stopped writing for extended periods, the forest responded aggressively, altering the cabin more rapidly and intensifying spatial distortions. Later entries introduced the concept of replacement. The writer theorized that the forest did not kill intruders. It absorbed them. It rewrote them. It studied their behaviors, habits, and memories until it could replicate their presence convincingly enough to maintain balance. The cabin was described as the final stage of this process. The writer began to suspect that the journal was not entirely written by them. Certain passages were written in the same handwriting but carried knowledge the writer insisted they did not possess. These sections described the forest's boundaries, its hunger, and its awareness of being observed by something beyond itself. At some point, the journal described the arrival of law enforcement before it happened. It detailed the officers' approach, their confusion, and their unease. It described the moment the journal would be discovered beneath the floor. These entries were written in the past tense, as though the events had already concluded. The writer no longer referred to themselves consistently. Pronouns shifted. Perspective fractured. The journal began alternating between detached observation and intimate familiarity with the writer's thoughts. It became impossible to determine where the author ended and the forest's influence began. One particularly long entry described a failed attempt to destroy the journal. The writer documented burning pages that reappeared intact the following morning. Tearing sections out only resulted in blank pages filling the gaps. The journal resisted erasure, reinforcing the idea that it existed independently of its author. The cabin's interior underwent its most drastic changes near the end of the journal. Walls elongated. Corners stretched unnaturally. The ceiling rose beyond reach. Despite this, the structure remained intact, as though obeying a logic incompatible with human perception. The writer noted that the cabin felt larger on the inside than the outside, an impossibility that became increasingly pronounced. The final entries focused on acceptance. The writer no longer expressed fear. Instead, there was resignation, a recognition that resistance only accelerated the process. The forest was described not as malicious but indifferent. It did not hate intruders. It did not pursue them. It simply integrated whatever crossed its threshold. The journal's tone became almost instructional. It warned that the forest did not target everyone. It responded to attention, to curiosity, to those who noticed it. The writer suggested that ignorance acted as a form of protection, while investigation invited assimilation. The penultimate entry described the writer standing at the edge of the clearing, observing the forest as it observed them. There was no longer a sense of separation. The writer described feeling distributed, as though their awareness extended into the trees, the soil, the cabin itself. Individual identity was described as a temporary arrangement. The final entry was brief. It stated that the journal was never meant to be finished, that endings implied separation and separation was no longer possible. The writer noted that whoever read the journal would already be part of the process. That recognition itself marked the beginning. The last line warned that the cabin would not appear abandoned to those meant to find it. When police cataloged the evidence, they found no trace of a body, no remains, no signs of struggle. The cabin was demolished weeks later, yet the forest reclaimed the clearing within days. New growth erased all evidence of human presence. The journal, however, remains intact. It continues to receive entries. The case was officially closed, filed as an unexplained disappearance. The journal was sealed away, never digitized, never released in full. Yet every few years, reports surface of a cabin that doesn't belong on any map. If this story unsettled you, subscribe. Some places only exist once they're noticed. And now you've noticed it,